Welcome back to this T-Chat on impeachment. We're back here with Richard Primus, who's a professor of constitutional law here at the University of Michigan. Thanks for coming back.
Happy to be here.
Great. So we're going to jump into some historical context around impeachment. So first question I have for you, is there anything important about how the impeachment process works in practice that is different than what the framers of the Constitution originally envisioned?
So the biggest thing is that we have a two-party system. The Constitution, for the most part, was written in ignorance of the fact that we would have a two-party system. It's not how they imagined the game was going to be played. And there are a bunch of features of the constitutional system that might have been built differently if they had known that was coming, but they didn't, right? And you can't really blame them. They couldn't beta test the Constitution. You get one shot and it's a new thing, and then off it goes. Relatively soon, American politics split into two parties by the end of the 1790s. And the first problem that division created for the impeachment process was that one of the parties thought, well, hey, we've got this impeachment thing. Maybe we can use it to knock out judges appointed by presidents of the other party. And they went on an offensive, this is when Thomas Jefferson was president, trying to pick off judges who had been appointed earlier. And for a little while it worked, and then the Senate said, no, this is not how this should work. This is not a good idea, right? And they refused to convict the highest profile judge who was impeached. And Jefferson backed off. And it sort of settled down, and people thought, okay, we have a two-party system, but that's not what impeachment is for. But later in our history, now, and in the last generation, the way the two-party system affects the impeachment process very powerfully is that it's almost never the case that a single political party controls 2/3 of the Senate. And you need 2/3 of the Senate to get a removal. In an impeachment of, let's say, a lower court judge for bribery, it's a relatively low salience political event. If the judge is really taking bribes, you can probably get agreement across the aisle on that and convict and get rid of the judge. But in a high salience impeachment, if you try to impeach a president or a vice president or a cabinet officer, the president wears multiple hats in our system, and one of them is the leader of a political party. And it's hard to get members of a political party whose political fortunes in a lot of ways are tied to that person to vote to say, this person is guilty of treason or bribery or a high crime and misdemeanor and has to go. It's very hard, which means that it's very hard to use the impeachment process as a successful way to remove a president in the modern two-party environment. Now, we don't know it's impossible, right? The one president who was successfully removed in the impeachment process was Richard Nixon, who was removed in the 70s. And he was a Republican, and he would not have been convicted without Republican votes in the Senate. And in fact, the moment that he threw in the towel and said, okay, I'm resigning, was precisely the moment that a delegation of Republican senators went to the White House and said, we've been backing you, and people have said you've done all kinds of bad things, and we've been backing you, and we're at the point where we just cannot back you anymore. And when Nixon knew that his support among Republicans in the Senate was weakening, that's the moment that he knew that he was going to lose, and so he left. Unless that moment happens, unless there's a moment where senators of the president's own party say, we can't take it anymore, impeachment isn't something that can lead to removal of a president under the dynamics of a two-party system. And the political parties today are significantly more polarized and dug in than they were in the 1970s. There was a much more ideological heterogeneity and crossover among the political parties in the 70s than there is today. That doesn't mean that we know that impeachment and removal couldn't work in an appropriate case today. It hasn't been tried, but it's a pretty significant obstacle to be overcome.
Great. That's super helpful. So you brought up the fact that the president wears multiple hats, right? So can you talk through kind of how those multiple roles in that particular example impacts an entire impeachment proceeding?
Sure. The president wears essentially 3 hats. He's the head of state, like the Queen in England, right? The symbolic and ceremonial personification of the United States of America. He is the head of the executive branch of the federal government, right? A very powerful institution, right? The military and all of the administrative agencies and like the federal boots on the ground getting things done everywhere. And that makes him also the single most powerful that and the veto power make him also the single most powerful player in the federal lawmaking process. Sure. The third hat is the political hat, as the leader of a political party. One of the things that a responsible president needs to do is to keep his roles separate in his own mind. In the course of a day, he probably has to do things in all 3 roles, but it's important to know when you're in which role. It's not appropriate to use your role as head of state or your role as head of the executive branch just to further the interests of a political party. That doesn't mean that presidents don't do things in their other roles that are helpful for their political parties. But it means you've got to be careful with that. And if you use the power that the presidency gives you wearing your other hats to persecute your political opponents, you're in a zone that the system isn't really built to handle. Constitutional government is like playground basketball. There's no real referee. People sometimes think of the Supreme Court as the referee in the game. That's not actually how it works. The Supreme Court, in a complicated way, is a player in the game. And as anyone who's ever played playground basketball knows, if you don't respect your opponent and the spirit of the game, if you care more about winning every round than you do about the spirit of the game will break down. One of the things that a president can do that's analogous to that is use the full power of his office under his head of state and head of government, head of executive branch hats for his own political purposes. That helps to cause the game to break down. And the impeachment process is one of the methods of last resort that the system has to try to self-correct if that problem presents itself.
Great. Thank you for that really colorful example. That really helps us understand that. So, diving into the history here in the U.S., how many federal officials have been impeached and how many federal officials have been removed from office?
So, in all of American history, the House has voted to impeach about 15 times. There have been proceedings about 60 times. And 8, maybe 9, have been convicted and removed. The ones who are convicted and removed have been judges, lower court judges. There are a couple of people who are also forced out Nixon style without actually being convicted, but it's rare. In, let's say, American history since World War II, in the history of modern America, sure. I believe there have been only 4 instances when someone was actually convicted in an impeachment trial, and they were all lower court judges.
So what have we learned from these previous impeachment proceedings?
So I think we've learned 2 different things, depending on whether we're talking about an impeachment like the impeachment of a lower court judge or a high salience impeachment like the impeachment of a president. When we're talking about the impeachment of a lower court judge, I think we've learned that the mechanism can work, and can work even in pretty contentious political times. The most recent judge to be impeached and convicted was impeached and convicted only 9 years ago at a time of pretty serious partisan division, and it was still possible to get 2/3 in the Senate.
Sure.
When we're talking about a much more high-stakes impeachment, an impeachment of a president, it's harder to know exactly what the lessons of history are because it's only been done 3 times. and under circumstances that are different from each other. There are no controlled experiments here. Andrew Johnson was impeached, and the story of his impeachment is intricate, and for people who are interested in that sort of thing, fascinating. But to think about what happened at a time of one-party rule and the immediate aftermath of a civil war might not tell you a whole lot about what impeachment is like in the very different environment of the 21st century.
Sure.
So the examples that we have that are closer in time to us are Nixon and Clinton. If we were to try to draw lessons from them, they might include these. First, it's going to be a heavily partisan event for a while. Both of those impeachments were. The Clinton impeachment was a very partisan event all the way to the end, which means Democrats never came around to the view that Clinton should be removed. A few Republicans in the Senate, when the vote was taken, voted to acquit rather than convict. But it was a pretty partisan affair all the way through. The Nixon impeachment was pretty partisan for most of its life. When the House was going through its process, it was almost entirely Democrats who were bringing the articles of impeachment forward. There were a few Republicans who climbed on board, and the fact that they climbed on board was a signal that this might have legs. And it was the moment when Republicans in the Senate said, you know what, this is really bad and we can't do it, that was the moment when it was clear that Nixon would be removed one way or the other. You could also draw this conclusion, although we only have 2 data points, so it's hard to know. Nixon and Clinton, I think it ought to be uncontroversial to say both did things that broke laws. Nixon was involved in a break-in and a cover-up and the violation of a bunch of campaign finance laws. Clinton lied under oath in a deposition about a sexual affair that he had had. These things are both illegal, right? But legality is not the test of impeachment. Something can be impeachable and be legal, something can be legal and not impeachable. The impeachment that worked was the impeachment where the underlying problem was about the kind of abuse of power that threatens the mechanisms of the government. If you can't trust the fairness of elections, you can't run a democratic constitutional system. The impeachment that didn't work was about, I would say, very poor behavior that was not about the mechanisms of the republic writ large. It was about very poor behavior, by a person who happened to occupy a very high office, and is significant for lots of those reasons.
Sure.
But different, right, in that way. It is possible that one day in the future someone will look back and say, that set a precedent for figuring out when impeachments are successful and the right way to go and when they're not. But until we have more experience going forward, we might just have 2 experiences and not actually a principle that we can draw from them.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard, for diving a little bit deeper into the historical context of impeachment here.
Well, happy to do it. Very happy to talk about this stuff. It's important.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for joining us in this segment of the Teach Out. We look forward to continuing the conversation.